Hi students, this week we're talking about American expansion. We're talking about the period in the late 19th century into the early 20th century when the United States starts to expand its influence. Up until this point in its history, it's grown to dominate the region in North America that's south of the St. Lawrence River and west of or east of the Mississippi River. And now we're going to see the spread of American influence to other parts of North America and to other parts of the world. And so we begin with Western expansion. We've seen this earlier in American history, but it's during this period when we really see the Western states, or the emergence of the Western states, and the settlement of Americans in the states in the Great Plains, in the plains of the Midwest. So much so that by 1900, a third of the American population now lives west of the Mississippi. We also see the last 9 of the 48 contiguous states accepted into the Union in the period between 1889 and 1912. So we're seeing the United States as we know it today spanning across the continent of North America. The West, like some of the other regions of America and the United States, but perhaps the West in particular, has myths, legends, ideas associated with it. This idea of the Wild West, the idea of the rancher, the idea of the cowboy, is something that's very much built into the history of North America. And it's associated both with the freedoms that come with the settlement of the Western United States, but also sometimes with traumatic consequences for people and things that existed in this region prior to its settlement and prior to its incorporation into this new nation. Settlement of the Western United States is first of all driven by mining, is driven by the gold rush in California that begins in 1849. Initially, we find prospectors rushing out to California as fast as they can and finding gold by sifting the deposits that they find in rivers. So it's something that one person can do alone, and that there's gold to be found that way. Gold in the silt that's been washed down the rivers from the mountains. What we begin to find as we come into the last part of the 19th century is that the advances in industrialization that we looked at earlier in this course start to be applied to mining. And so we start to find what becomes known as strip mining, where, for example, large, powerful hydraulic hoses that could not have been built in decades past are being used to erase and wipe off and strip away, that's why it's known as strip mining, to strip away the topsoil from the mountains and to find the veins of gold and silver underneath. And this is a very quick and efficient way of finding these precious metals. Of course, it also has severe consequences for the environment. That this topsoil that is washed away is lost from the mountains. The mountains lose that part of their ecosystem. The topsoil that's washed away is washed down rivers, clogs the rivers, it leads to flooding and droughts. And so at the same time as the West is providing new resources and drawing Americans out there, as I've said, there are consequences to some of the more reckless exploitations of the resources that are available. Life in the Midwestern states, which starts to develop, so people first come to California and then start to move east back into the Midwest states, and then people continue to expand westward from the Mississippi as well. Life in these states was very difficult. Anyone who's lived in the Midwest knows that it is a climate of intense heat and intense cold, intense wind, and the climate and the soil was very different from the settlement of states further to the east. These weren't the fertile lands of Kentucky or Ohio that could be planted with crops and made to be successful. Growing crops in these lands was very, very difficult. What the settlers eventually find is that the agricultural product that's most successful in these regions is raising cattle. And so we find that cattle herding is established as the typical typical occupation of these settlers. So much so that by 1883, there are 500,000 cattle just in eastern Montana alone. And this keeping of cattle and raising of cattle initially carried out as a ranching exercise. Cattle are roaming through these lands, and the ranchers are kind of following them and keeping an eye on them, rounding them up when necessary. But that after, in particular, the invention of barbed wire and cheap fencing, we start to see the transition from cattle ranching to cattle farming. And so this also has consequences. It means that land that previously was free range for both poorer settlers and for Native American Indians who lived a nomadic lifestyle, that this is being fenced off from them. That the amount of land that's available to these groups is shrinking. At the same time, the federal government is supporting the expansion of American settlement in the West and of cattle farming. And other types of farming as well, in particular wheat, which also develops as a staple crop in this region. And the federal government supports this settlement by providing cheap land that's easy to buy, so cheap that people who had no experience of farming thought they would give this a go, that they would brave the difficulties of the Midwest because access to land and freedom that they associated with the West seemed to be so available. So the federal government provides cheap land, and it also sponsors and encourages the building of railroads. Building of railroads, which is crucial to the success of cattle farming. Crucial to the success of cattle farming because it enables the cattle to be shipped to big cities, so that the city of Chicago grows into a giant metropolis as a result of the cattle industry, which makes Chicago the leading slaughterhouse in the world. Access to the railroads means that these farmers are not restricted living in small towns with small populations, but they are able to access large populations, and therefore that large farms can make them very wealthy and very successful.